I read Good for You by Camille Pagan. This is the first time that I've read this book. It is a women's fiction romance. Women's fiction in the sense that it's like has a easygoing kind of comedic tone to it. There's a wryness to women's fiction that makes it a lot of fun to read. And just like the rest of this genre, there's kind of story of loss and then self-discovery and re-empowerment. That's kind of the arc of the women's fiction genre, generally speaking. And then you put in the romance on top of that. And so at the end of the story, you get a romantic partner. And this story pretty much follows that formula. It's about a woman named Allie Jackson who lives in New York City, and her dream ever since she was a little girl was to be the editor in chief at a magazine called Good for You, which is where, the book gets its name, which is like a really clever title for a magazine, I think. It seems like a women's lifestyle magazine kind of situation. But the magazine is having all kinds of problems because, like, who reads magazines? The internet, influencers, and on like that. Times are changing. The magazine doesn't know how to cope with this, and it tries to do all of the traditional business type choices of firing people, reorganizing, and just hoping that the market will come back to the way it was, 40 years ago or something. And so Allie is given this bad decision to make at the beginning of the story where she's going to have to fire some people. She's going to have to free up a bunch of money in the company, and she feels like there is no room to cut. And so she agrees to lower her wages so that she doesn't have to fire anybody, but also because she wants to keep the job because her entire identity is like really, really wrapped up in being the editor in chief. And her boss he's like, a great idea, that'll work out really well, and does not offer to like lower his wages or like get rid of his bonus or something like that. And this entire thing kind of puts a real strain on Allie, where she's already been under a lot of pressure. And this is kind of like the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? Where her brother, who was the closest person to her in her life, has passed away about a year ago or something. And she's been throwing herself into work to try and avoid confronting the grief that this has made her feel. And so she copes with her grief in a lot of ways, mostly avoidant behavior, and mostly by being like a workaholic type of a person. And the entire book is from Allie's point of view, and we can see from the way that she talks about herself and the way that she sees everybody else that she feels very out of place in the world. She doesn't feel like she's normal. She feels like everybody else has it together, but there's something wrong with her, and that she needs to constantly be pouring her energy into becoming or appearing to be more normal. And so that's like a big psychic strain to begin with, and then add to it, losing the person who you could actually be real with and you didn't have to put up a front. And then this whole thing of like the company that you work for and has been your dream for your entire life is slowly collapsing around you while you are in charge of it. On top of all that, deep underneath the surface, Allie was raised by abusive and neglectful parents who left her with like a lot of covered up trauma that she can't remember because she has like PTSD style memory loss. And again, her coping strategies are, avoidance, overwork, and things like that. So that's part of the reason why she is avoiding confronting the death of her brother, because that's the coping style that she learned when she was a child in an abusive home. And all of this kind of collectively comes to a head where she manages to save the job of her assistant. And then at lunch that day, the assistant says some snide things to her, and Allie blows up at her, but kind of like blacks out in terms of her memory. She has like a time skip where she can't remember what happened. And the narrative like skips over this. So we as the readers also don't know what happened. And this is directly related to, like I said, the PTSD, the way that your memory covers up really traumatic events. And that is like a coping strategy for the brain to not get slowed down in survival when these really heinous things happen to you. And so she is worried about losing her identity and, all of these other things that are going on. And then the ingratitude of her assistant leads her to like just have a breakdown and go into some kind of screaming fit. The thing about this is that somebody was filming the whole thing on their phone and then post it to the internet. And this causes a kind of scandal, like a viral scandal to happen that's bad for the magazine company. And so she is put on leave and she's asked to kind of like sort herself out. And so she goes home. She's really distressed about everything that's happened. She tells her boyfriend what's going on. He's not super empathetic or very dialed into her situation. And they get into an argument that leads to her breaking up with him. But the thing is, they live together and the apartment belongs to him. And so she kind of like, she loses her job. She loses, she lost out on her pay. She basically like loses her position, the thing that was the dream of her entire life. She's forced to confront the death of her brother because now there's nothing else taking up her time. She loses her boyfriend. She loses her home, like all of this stuff. It's pretty devastating right up front. And I think Pagan does a great job of like tearing down this character to her most kind of essential self. And it's a classic like women's fiction scenario where she's in the big New York City with the high pressure job. And then she's forced to retreat back to the community of her girlhood where she's more vulnerable, but she has roots that put her back in touch with who she was, which is a person that she desperately does not want to be. She doesn't want to confront. She doesn't want to think about her girlhood self. But she has no choice because she's lost all of the things that were the defense against that part of her identity. And so she has to go back to Michigan where her brother left her a house. And she's been avoiding the attorney and all of the people who are dealing with his estate. And she's like, well, now is the time to do it. I'm going to go to the house. I'm going to sell the house. And that way I'll have some money and I'll get my job back at the magazine and get my life back on track. So that's her plan. But when she walks into the house, she finds out that it's occupied by a scruffy, slovenly guy named Wyatt with a big bushy beard. And this is shocking to her, and she's grossed out by him. And he explains to her that Wyatt was the best friend to her brother Luke before he died, and that the house has been left not only to her, but also to Wyatt, and that Wyatt is the executor of his will, actually. And so now Allie has been stripped of, all of these things that kept her vulnerability in check, that made her feel safe in the world. And now she's being confronted with this person who, in so many ways, feels like the opposite of what she would choose or want, but she has no choice but to spend time with him because she has nowhere else to go, and she has to deal with this situation about her brother's death. And Wyatt has been trying to get in contact with her so that, he can finish out the problems with the estate. And her plan to sell the house is exploded because of, the fact that Wyatt owns half the property as well. And he's not looking to sell. He doesn't want to sell. And he thinks that Luke left it to them for a reason and that they should honor that and not just like cash it in like it's some kind of asset, but try to deliberately follow what Luke wanted for them in their lives. And so when Allie and Luke were little, Luke was her protector. He was the older brother. He was always looking out for her, not just physically, but emotionally as well. And she was very devoted to him and loved him very much for that. But there's a way in which in the story that even though Luke is dead, he continues to look out for Allie's emotional well-being. And I guess also her material needs because he leaves her some money to inherit. And there's also a life insurance policy that she's going to inherit the money from. And so in so many ways, he tries to provide for her in the way that their parents did not provide for him and her, that he tried to take care of her to the best of his ability. And that a lot of Allie's success doesn't just come down to the kind of coping mechanisms that she has where she's a workaholic and she's able to kind of, shut off a certain part of her emotions and allow herself to go through abuse that other people would quit and then, find success through that because of all of the coping mechanisms, like I said. What she really is determined to become a different person. And that's why she left her hometown. That's why she calls herself by a different name than the one that she was given as a child. And she has these really big goals for her life because they're the kind of goals that could never be achieved by the person that she was raised to be. And so I think a big part of, and this is tied to the memory thing of her character is this identity crisis that she's building up this kind of persona or ego for her to then step into almost like a suit of armor where she doesn't have to be the vulnerable person, that her brother was taking care of, that her father was beating, that her mother was neglecting and verbally abusing. Instead, she can be this high-powered, successful editor-in-chief in another part of the world that is, respected and has money and all of this kind of stuff. But no matter what she does, she actually can't get away from herself. And I think the arc that she goes through in the story is coming to see herself the way that her brother always saw her, that he saw that she never needed to change, that she was already lovable, that she was already good, and her strength is real and is not like some kind of persona over there or armor that she needs to put on, that she already had the strength to endure all the things that life threw at her. She just covered it up in the way that her mind was taking away her memories. She was kind of covering things up consciously as well and telling herself, this isn't me, this isn't me, this isn't me. I'm going to become a person who doesn't have any of these problems. All of that is a type of strength. She just, at the same time, doesn't trust herself. And so I think a lot of the story is about breaking down that armor, if you will, and then allowing her to see that she is trustworthy in terms of being able to be in touch with her past and be herself and have everything that she wants for herself still. The energy between Wyatt and Allie kind of reminds me of like an Odd Couple situation, where one of them is sloppy, the other one is hyper clean, hyper organized. Wyatt is kind of a slacker. He has quit his job as an investment banker and is just like not interested in going back into that career space. And so is just kind of like living, by the lake in this house and not too concerned about finding a job or something. And Allie, on the other hand, is like putting all of her energy in trying to get her job back when, the magazine is telling her, you got to take 6 months off at least before we can even talk about what your role will be going forward, but it's not going to be editor in chief. And she's trying to clean up after Wyatt and take care of everything. And so they're just complete opposites in a lot of ways. I think Wyatt is very in touch with his grief and his unhappiness. And Allie is very avoidant. She projects a lot onto Wyatt. She tells herself a lot of stories about the kind of person that he is without ever actually talking to him. So she's very like judgmental, I guess, at the beginning of the story. But I think she's that way because she wants to put up barriers between her and Wyatt. She doesn't want to make friends with him. She doesn't want to like him because then that makes her vulnerable, right? She's trying to put on that suit of armor, like I said. And after she's lost so much here, I don't think that she emotionally feels like she can take that risk of making a new friend or liking Wyatt. And it's kind of easy to keep her distance from him because he's so sloppy and gross. But of course, since it's a romance story, like this is the guy, they're total opposites. Opposites attract. There is an energy between them right away that they're attracted to each other. They, walk in on each other naked at different times, and she likes his body. He manages to clean himself up and not be so scruffy, and she's more into him once he does that. And they kind of rub off on each other. So, like, he gets more organized and starts making plans about life in the world, and she becomes less rigid and more relaxed and more in touch with her emotions to the degree that she can be anyway. And eventually they start up a romance. They hop into bed together. And for Allie, it's better than it's ever been with anybody else. But she's also with a guy who knows a lot about her past already. It already has a pretty good sense of who she is, was best friends with the person who was her protector and the closest person to her in her life. And so he kind of has a way of stepping into that emotional space in a surrogate way. He's very protective of her. He's very mindful of her moods and needs. And so she feels really safe with him and really known and seen as well, which I think is the thing that she needs to bridge that gap between, who she is and who she thinks she should be, like kind of crossing the bridge back over from who she believes she should be to who she actually is, and learning to let go of the idea of being the editor-in-chief and New York and all of that kind of stuff. And as she goes through the story, she regains more and more of her memories. She grapples with her PTSD. She comes into contact with her estranged mother, and they get back into a relationship with each other. She urges Wyatt to get in touch with his mother, who he is estranged from, and reestablish contact. And he does that, at her at her behest. And he deals with his grief around Luke in a more healthy way. And so they make a good bond, and they're good for each other in terms of recovering from their grief. And it feels as if Luke was kind of the architect of the entire friendship coming together. He cared about both of them so much. And it seemed like he put them together because they needed each other. They complemented each other in a certain sense. And so his presence persists through the book in a way that feels really heartwarming and I think is interesting. At the end of the book, Allie has opportunity to go back to the magazine, and she also has a choice to kind of take over an emerging business from her assistant who was promoted to editor in chief and then quit the magazine to start her own business. And she wants Allie to come work with her and kind of be the editor in chief of a whole bunch of magazines that are going to be like the kind of inside the corporation, like this is our newsletter type magazine situation. She would be in charge of all of those different accounts and, like edit the content and articles and on like that. And for both of those jobs, like she could go back to New York, she could be in the high powered system with the big money and the respect and the power. But she doesn't even want that anymore because she doesn't have such a strong need to have that protection and that coping mechanism anymore because of the ways in which she's gotten back in touch with who she was when she was younger and learning to have more compassion for herself, figuring out that her parents might not have been totally evil, that they had their own demons they were wrestling with. And she also remembers, she watches the video that was put on the internet that she couldn't remember what happened. And so it's interesting. It's like her memory sits outside of her own mind and body and is put out, in the internet in this way where she can watch what happened. And the entire meltdown that she had, she was so ashamed of it that she wouldn't watch. But it turns out that the meltdown was only embarrassing for the magazine because it revealed all of the ways in which the magazine is being run incompetently and the magazine is inadequate to serving the needs of the market. And that she knows that and she has great ideas for how to fix it, but she's going through a really hard time and they're putting pressure on her that she doesn't deserve. And that's all the stuff that she talks about, when she starts screaming at people in the lunchroom. And so really the traumatizing memory that her mind was covering up from herself was a moment of self-love and compassion for herself and kind of speaking to what she actually needs in her life. And her mind could not accept that right then because that kind of deep vulnerability is not something that she was ever able to give to herself. It was the kind of thing that her brother Luke would give to her. But now he's not there anymore. And so the entire thing of his will and the house and setting him up with Wyatt and all of this stuff that Luke did feels like he kind of like created a path for her to journey on in order to come back to that place that she was at the beginning of the story and advocating for herself and speaking the truth. By the end of the story, she's able to inhabit that space without having the panic attack or blanking out her memory. She's just able to say, no, I don't want to be the editor-in-chief. You're running the magazine the wrong way. It doesn't make sense for the future. No, I don't want to be the editor-in-chief of your new business because you are also incompetent and you're just going to use me. Instead, I'm going to start living a whole new life. And she makes a commitment to be with Wyatt and to explore something totally different and kind of reconnect with her mother, reconnect with some of the other people that she had close friendships with in the community and has come back to, and keep this house that was so important to her brother. And so the entire shape of the book is like really heartwarming and empowering and sweet, which is exactly kind of what you're looking for from women's fiction, especially when it has the romance thrown in there. But there's all kinds of interesting, authentic elements to this book in particular that I thought were really well done. And it had plenty of humor sprinkled all the way through, but delivers, the exact kind of experience that you're looking for with this genre of book, but also had interesting, psychological elements to it as well that I think a lot of people could relate to. And so it was a sweet little read.